Now we are going to discuss the second feature of behaviorism, that's called classical conditioning. Classical conditioning was introduced by John Watson during 1913. He proposed learning as the process of classical conditioning, which was based on Pavlov's observation. So he also followed the same process of learning, which was neutral stimulus associated with unconditioned stimulus becoming conditioned stimulus, leading to a conditioned response. This particular theory and this particular conditioning refutes the existence of the mind or consciousness. Again, Watson also believed that learning is a behavior that emerges out of one's experiences or events that takes place in one's life, and the internal or mental process has no role in the development of one's behavior. Classical conditioning theory involves learning a new behavior via the process of association. That's what we have seen in Pavlov's process also, in the process of conditioning, that you develop behavior through a process of association. That how a neutral stimulus, when associated with unconditioned stimulus, that unconditioned stimulus becomes a stimulus which is conditioned, leading to conditioned response. So that is how through association the learning or behavior takes place. Now this particular conditioning follows 3 stages: before, during, and after conditioning. Let's look at the image here and figure out what classical conditioning is. In before conditioning, you see neutral stimulus, which is neutral, that means it's not going to produce any response, so no response. This stage also involves the neutral stimulus has no response in this stage. The neutral stimulus can be a person, object, place, and in classical conditioning does not produce a response until it is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. During conditioning, this stage is a stimulus which produces no response, that is neutral stimulus. It is associated with the unconditioned stimulus, at which point it now becomes as conditioned stimulus. For example, you have a stomach virus, which is unconditioned stimulus, might be associated with kind of eating a stale food, which is a conditioned stimulus. Therefore, often during this stage, the unconditioned stimulus must be associated with the conditioned stimulus on number of occasions or trials for learning to take place. After conditioning, now in this stage, the neutral response becomes a conditioned stimulus, and it has been associated with the unconditioned stimulus to create a new conditioned response. For example, a person who has been associated with good clothing, nice perfume, is now found attractive. It was unconditioned stimulus, and now when it is found attractive, becomes conditioned response. Watson famously said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist. I might select doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar, man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and the race of his ancestors." So what he's saying is that you provide me with infant and I will condition them, train them to behave in a manner that I want them, regardless of their abilities, race, vocations, tendencies, everything. And he conducted an experiment on a 9-month-old child. So let's see what he did with him. Alright, so let's see Watson's little Albert's experiment. Now before conditioning, baby Albert is allowed to play with a pet rat. Albert enjoys petting the rat and does not fear it. So in this stage, Albert is described on the whole as stolid and unemotional, to quote, and showed no fear of any of these stimuli. However, what did startle him and cause him to be afraid was if a hammer was struck against the bar. So he was scared of loud noise before conditioning stage. During conditioning, Albert was 11 months old, and when he tried to pet or come near the rat, Watson would make a loud noise. This would scare Albert. This scaring when coming close situation was repeated many times. By now, towards the end or the last stage of conditioning, little Albert only had to see the rat and he immediately showed every sign of fear. He would cry whether or not the hammer was hit against the steel, and he would attempt to crawl away. So this particular conditioning or classical conditioning theory supports nurture over nature. That means learning from the environment. The environmental factors, they are responsible for shaping up of one's behavior, instead of nature, which contributes that one is born with innate abilities to learn or to develop behavior. Classical conditioning theory is scientific. It is based on empirical evidence that is collected from controlled experiments. It also believes that it provides reductionist explanation of behavior. That means that a complex behavior is broken into small stimulus response units for its analysis. It's a determinist theory, which means that it is not left to individual at their own free will to come up with certain procedure. Rather, it follows specific certain guidelines or certain pattern for observing the developing of or the practicing of certain behaviors. To conclude, the classical conditioning based on Pavlovian conditioning and considered stimulus and response responsible for pattern of behavior and follows 3 stages of conditioning, which is before, during, and after.